Now, Hume does something a bit peculiar here, which is he presents an objection to his own universal generalization. So he said all ideas come from impressions, and he's given some arguments for that thesis. But then he says there's one contradictory phenomenon, as he calls it, that is one kind of exception to this rule that he can think of, which is famously known as the missing shade of blue. And this is what he describes in the rest of section 2. So here's what he imagines. He says, imagine we have a kind of color palette. We have a person who's seen a number of different shades of blue, ranging from lighter to darker. And they haven't seen some shades that are intermediate between some of the other shades. So imagine that there's a kind of perfect gradation up to a certain point, and then there's a shade of blue in between some shade of blue that's a bit darker and some shade of blue that's a bit lighter that they haven't seen. Hume wants to say that each of the shades of blue must itself be, if a person has had an experience of it, must itself be an impression, and a distinct impression. So the person has had an impression of each of these shades, but they haven't had an impression of the missing shade. Nonetheless, Hume says, it's not unreasonable to think that this person would be able to imagine the missing shade of blue, that they'd be able to come up with the shade of blue themselves in their mind. And that suggests that there would be an idea that didn't come directly from an impression. So you can run this experiment yourself. Can you imagine the shade of blue that is in between the two that are presented here on the screen? Even if you can, unfortunately, there's one possible response in your case, which is maybe you actually have seen a shade of blue that's intermediate between those. So we have to ask the question in a more general way and say, do you think it is possible for someone who has never seen a particular shade of a color to nonetheless imagine that particular shade by kind of going for a shade that's intermediate between colors that they have seen? And in the last paragraph of section 2, Hume gives a kind of indication of how he's going to argue for a lot of the rest of this book. He makes a suggestion of how to approach what he calls metaphysical reasonings. Basically, the topics of the so-called abstruse philosophy that he had mentioned earlier. But also, kind of big questions about the nature of reality, or of the, what is the definition of cause and effect and the relationship between cause and effect, whether the mind is the same kind of substance as the body, those kinds of metaphysical questions. And so Hume makes his suggestion as follows. He writes, I'll just read the paragraph to you. Here, therefore, is a proposition which not only seems in itself simple and intelligible, but if a proper use were made of it, might render every dispute equally intelligible. So the proposition he has in mind is the claim that all ideas come from impressions. This is going to be the kind of keystone of his whole way of arguing and his whole philosophy. Once we realize that all ideas come from impressions, we can do a lot of clarifying work in metaphysics. We can clear up a lot of problems in metaphysics once we recognize that all of our ideas have to come from impressions. So he's going to say more about that now. He says, if a proper use were made of it, this claim that all ideas come from impressions might render every dispute equally intelligible and banish all that jargon which has so long taken possession of metaphysical reasonings and drawn disgrace upon them. All ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. The mind has but a slender hold of them. They are apt to be confounded with other resembling ideas, and when we have often employed any term, that is, any word, though without a distinct meaning, we are apt to imagine it has a determinate idea annexed to it. So sometimes we use words thinking that they have determinate ideas attached to them, but sometimes they don't. On the contrary, all impressions, that is, all sensations, either outward or inward, are strong and vivid. The limits between them are more exactly determined, nor is it easy to fall into any error or mistake with regard to them. When we entertain, therefore, any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need but inquire, from what impression is that supposed idea derived? And if it be impossible to assign any, this will serve to confirm our suspicion. By bringing ideas into so clear a light, we may reasonably hope to remove all dispute which may arise concerning their nature and reality. So what Hume is basically saying here is that we have a much firmer hold on our impressions than we do on our ideas. Our ideas are often very confused, muddled, kind of distant reflections or distant copies of our impressions. Our impressions are very vivid and very well known and understood. So when we're dealing with ideas, as we often are in philosophy, we need to either be able to very clearly trace them back to the impressions that they come from, or we have a good reason to be suspicious of them. We have a good reason to think that they're not really based on anything that we have a firm grasp of or that we really know very well. Notice how different this is from the way that both Plato and Descartes had reason. Take Descartes as an example. One of the first things Descartes did was try to convince us that we can't trust our senses, that we need to rely on clear and distinct ideas, ultimately, as he puts it, to be able to have any confidence in what our senses appear to be telling us. Well, Hume is saying almost exactly the opposite. He's saying any of our ideas, clear and distinct or otherwise, are not as clearly known as our impressions. The sensations we have are very well known. Our experiences are very well known. And so any philosophy or any theory that can't be traced back to experience is ultimately, he thinks, bad theory, if there's going to be some kind of problem with it. And the practice of trying to trace theory back to experience is a practice that will allow us to do better theory. At the beginning of section 3, Hume asserts that our ideas are connected with each other. And he takes this to be pretty obvious, that our ideas don't occur to us just in a random way, but that they have a lot of connections, so that one idea kind of calls to mind another idea. There's what you might call a logical relation between ideas, or that there's some kind of association between ideas, another way of talking about connection that Hume sometimes uses. And then he goes on to say that there really are only 3 ways that our ideas are connected. And he admits that this is a bit hard to justify or argue for in the abstract, the claim that there are just these 3 ways, but he kind of challenges us to, whenever we are thinking about connections between ideas, to ask what ultimately really is the connection. What is the connection most fundamentally between those? And he thinks we'll find, if we carry out that process for each relation between ideas that we notice, we'll find that they all boil down to one of these 3. And the 3 are resemblance, that 2 ideas appear similar to one another or have a similar character to one another. Contiguity in space and time, that is, that they occur together at the same time, or that they occur together in the same space. So that, for instance, heat and fire might have been experienced contiguously in space and in time, that whenever we saw a fire, when we're near to it, that we also felt heat, for instance. And then another is through cause and effect. So when we see or hear one idea, shortly after we see or hear one impression, we see or hear another impression. I'm mixing up a little bit discussion of impressions and ideas. I apologize for that. But the basic principle here is that that ideas are only, the contents of our mind are only connected with one another in these 3 ways, according to Hume. So now what I want to ask you is, do you agree with this? Can you think of other ways that ideas are connected that don't fall into these 3 categories? And if so, what are they?